Good morning, everyone. My name is Callie. I will be your moderator for today, which means I'm basically going to sit back and listen and let Lilith take over. We've got a couple of minutes before, okay, what time is it? It is almost 1 o'clock your time. It is currently almost 11 my time, so forgive me if I say the wrong times. Once we get started, it will be all Lilith. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to ask questions. Lilith, that's up to you.
Either audio or chat is fine. I have the chat up, so I'll see it, but audio will be better if I'm actually like in the middle of painting because my head will be down.
Okay.
Looking at me will not be interesting. Looking at the document camera where you can see me doing stuff.
True.
This is why this is why it's set up this way.
Yeah. Yeah. So right now we're just kind of chit-chatting.
Giving people a couple of minutes to come in, because of course, if people show up, no one shows up on time, even online. It's SEA.
So. I'm really impressed with the crowd that we've got so far. This is awesome. And I apologize if you're hearing squeaking. My dog has found her squeaky toy.
I cannot hear squeaking, and even if I could, that would be okay. Because
Callie, I was just wondering what group you're with if you're 2 hours different from us.
So I basically, and I use the term grow up lightly, grew up in Northkeep. I am currently living in the barony of Glenmere in Ontario. I'm up in Washington State.
But she's still Northkeep.
Yes, and you are muted, Etienne.
Yeah, I tried to move to Oregon, kind of to the larger Portland area. I have friends up there, but that didn't work. So I'm back down here. So I'm aware of Ontario. Yeah.
Yes, it is horrendously expensive up here.
Yeah, it is. It unfortunately is. But anyway, thank you.
You're welcome.
And just so folks know, the record is already on. So anything you say
will not be used against you
in a court of law.
All right,
well, royal court, but
I'm showing it as 1 o'clock. We are going to go ahead and let Lilith get started. If you have any questions, please speak up, particularly if she's painting, because she won't be able to see if her head is down, but we will be able to see her wonderful document that she's actively working on. So this is not going to be, while it would probably be more fun if we were interactive and in person, we'll take what we can get. So Lilith, it's all yours, and thank you.
So welcome to Fear Not The Froo, Easy Tips for Detail Work. I am Lilith McGuffin. If you don't know me, there may be a couple of people in here who don't know me. I have been doing Scribble in the SCA for a couple of decades. I've been our Kingdom Scribe. I've been the Regional Scribe. I've taught at a whole bunch of I've taught a bunch of classes. I've taught this one a lot, because including at Gulf Wars, because for me, the white work is, it's the icing on the cake. It's the fun part. It's my reward for getting to do all the other parts. And it makes me sad when people would be like, oh, but it's scary and it's hard and I'm afraid to try it because I don't want to ruin what I've done. And I was like, I should explain some nice, easy ways to do this that are not intimidating and kind of break it down for people. So that's what this class is about. And these are styles and elements that can be used in almost any time period and almost any style, especially in any of the European styles that we're used to dealing with. These are basic skills that are very useful for almost anything you're going to do on an Osteoran scroll. Or other kingdoms. They're obviously useful for originals and other things as well, but they are designed for that purpose. So we are gonna, so detail work, of course, as I'm defining it for this class, your white work, shading, dots, anything after your basic fill looks complicated, but a lot of it is made up of single strokes, single dots, and very basic patterns that are not all that difficult to pull off. So we're going to go over the basics of how to design and apply dots. We're going to discuss geometric patterns, and we're going to discuss very simple shading techniques in the next hour. So, and again, feel free to ask questions as we're going if you have any. The first one we're going to go over is dots and dot clusters, which we have an example here that from Pliny the Elder's Historia Naturalis. You can see that there are dots in multiple groups. So groups of 3 dots is very, very common. all over the place, but sometimes you get bigger ones like these clusters that demonstrate, they kind of look like flowers with 6 or 7 around a central point. These patterns date back as far as the Roman Empire. So 1st century AD, you often see them on white vine work and illumination of the period. Anything with lots of bold color and spaces to fill can have dots to fill in that space. They're always white if they're on the blue, but on some other colors, you might see them in black or gold, metallic. So dots are fun. These patterns are great space filler, and all you need is one fine-tipped brush, or if you prefer, you can use a toothpick. And I'm going to demonstrate both of those techniques today. And the toothpick is nice because it keeps the tip and makes a much rounder circle a little more easily, sometimes than a brush if you're just starting out. Once you've completed filling your large areas of color, I'm going to show you this here in a minute. You're going to let it dry completely. You're going to hear this instruction a lot. Always let it dry completely. And then you're going to take your brush or your toothpick. You're going to get your paint on it, and you're going to make sure it's not too watery, because if it's watery and you put it down, it's going to run everywhere. So make sure you don't have too much paint, because this is really a very little bit of paint at a time for techniques with white work. Because remember, you're working with a water-based paint. And if it's humid out, even less water. If it's humid, like today is nice and dry because it's cold out, I'm probably going to need a little more water. And we'll see how well that goes here in a minute. You just need a little bit, and then once you have it on your implement of choice, you're going to place things close together. So what I'm going to do now is pull up my camera, and we're going to do this. Because I have here a Star of Merit. A lot of people have probably seen this lovely Celtic animal. And I have white paint, my permanent white. And when you're doing dots with a brush, and I prefer a brush personally, just for control and speed, because it holds a little more paint at a time than a toothpick. But if you're beginning, the toothpick is often easier. I'm going to get water. I'm going to get white on my brush. And yep, it's dry today. A little more water. And if I'm going to put dots on here, I'm just going to go in very carefully and just stick on my brush onto there until I have it the size I want, and I have a nice little round dot. Now, if I'm going to do groups of 3 for most of this, I'm just going to make little triangles. Kind of close together. There is no exact distance apart they have to be. You're eyeballing this. Do not try and overthink it. You're just spacing them so that from a distance of a couple of feet, they look fairly evenly spread across your page. And you can change the direction that you're going by just changing, the direction of your dot points. Again, I like the brush because you can do more dots before you have to refill. And they just kind of go on there nice and cute. If you run into a space that's really narrow, you can do just like a line of 3 dots if you need to do something like that. You can do the clusters we looked at earlier. If they're a little uneven, that is okay. If you looked at my period example that I had up earlier, they are not perfectly round. So if your dots are not perfectly round, they're a little comma-esque, they're a little, dashy looking, it is okay. They do not have to be perfectly round. So if that's not where they're at, you're okay. But dots are not incredibly complicated. And as you see here, you get a really nice effect. That took a couple of minutes, but when you're done, it's, there's 6 million dots on a scroll, and it looks really fancy and it looks really complicated. But that's the basics with the white. Are there any questions at this point on dots, forming dots, mixing the paint, anything we've covered so far? No, okay. So basically the same, but if you were going to do this for one of the things you'll notice, we're going to go to another example here real quick on this, is the Celts love to do red dot designs. This is a picture of the Book of Duro. You see this in Kells. They love to outline in red dots and fill in patterns in red dots. And it's the same thing. It looks really complicated, but it's just a matter of putting one dot at a time and keeping them visually reasonably spaced. But if you look at these, especially if you look at the ones between the letters, they're not perfectly round. And they're not all exactly the same shape or exactly the same size or the exact same distance apart. Approximate is fine as long as they look fairly even when you're done. And now part of why I picked this scroll that we're looking at is because it's a Celtic scroll. So obviously it needs red dots. Now for this part, I am going to use a toothpick just so you can see how that works and how it looks a little different with your good old garden variety toothpick. Now, one thing to remember with these is the longer you press, the bigger and the flatter that end is going to get. So you will want to change out your toothpick when you notice your dots are starting to get consistently larger. Because otherwise you're going to end up with an unevenness as you go around, or if you change it out later, it's going to be, oh, that one's really bigger than the one next to it, which is also okay. But if you want them to be even, which I know a lot of people would like their dots to be even, changing out your toothpick when you notice that the end is getting bigger is a good way to go about that. And that's going to vary by person because it really depends on how heavy your hand is compared to somebody else's. But if I'm going to do this with the red, and for this I'm using cadmium red pale, which is basically that orangey lighter red color that you see all over Celtic scrolls. So it's a really useful one to have and to use. And it is in fact the one I used as the basis for this central area in here earlier. But I'm going to get water in here and I'm going to mix up some paint on this lovely dry winter day. And once I've got a good bit on the end of this little toothpick, I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to make a dot. And another dot. And now you'll notice though, I'm already running out of paint. So these are great for round. They are a little bit slower. The paint should be a little bit thinner than it would be for if you were painting solid fill, just because you want it to drip off nicely just a little bit, but not so wet that it's actually dripping, because you don't want that part, or it'll go where you don't want it. And for the Celtic design, as you may have noticed on the example piece, it's for outlining, it's generally just one line around the outline of the whole figure. Sometimes they'll get crazy and do two, but the outline itself is just several little dots going on their merry way in a line. And then if they decide they want to do a pattern in a space, you can always look at them for different patterns that they do, but if they're doing a pattern in a space, let's say you've got a space in here down by this guy, and they have extra space once they put in their line, sometimes you'll see little things like a little cross design or little circles, or they'll do little geometric patterns or crisscrosses just out of dots to fill in the space because they have all of that big open space they like to fill in. This is dots with a toothpick. Are there any questions about dots in general, about how to do anything with these in particular? If you ever tried this before, any problems you had with it?
The term that the Celts, well, not the Celts, the artistic world uses for filling everything in like the Celts seem to like to do is called vacui hori.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a technical artistic term for that.
Right. Thank you. But yeah, so that's dots. And of course, if we were going to do this whole thing today, by the time I got done, I will finish this later, of course, so we can turn it into the kingdom. But that's dots. You just fill space. They're wonderful for filling space. And as a visual design, they make everything, seem much more intricate. But it is just a matter of placing one dot at a time and keeping them evenly spaced. So it's just practice. And they go on a lot of different designs. So, because unsurprisingly, dots are something that they used all throughout history to fill things in. If there are not questions on dots, we shall move on to our next element. So, geometric patterns. Now, for geometric patterns, these also go well in any chart or design that has long, thin spaces that have been left open and blank. Those are designed specifically for this purpose. Anytime you see these, and it was big in especially French scrolls, the French kind of invented the bar and ivy as a concept, and then it took over. So you see it for several hundred years, and you see it in France, you see it in England, you see it in Germany. Different cultures have their own take on it, but they all have these long, skinny spaces, these bars designed for geometric patterns. And now you're going, okay, geometry, math, you've lost me. No. I'll say these are, I've got some simplified ways to go about this today. Again, once you've filled in your paint area, you've let it dry completely. For this, if you are not a freehand kind of person, I recommend using a straight edge or a ruler, because you're going to mark the middle points of each of your pattern elements. If you're doing a zigzag, you're going to end up just kind of pre-marking very lightly dots along your bar for where you want that brush to come to and stop, to give you just a visual guide to do a design. And we're going to look at this here in a minute. But to make it consistent, because I know it's the hardest part for at least for me when I was starting out, and for many people, is the fact that geometric patterns are supposed to be geometric. So of course they're supposed to be measured and the same, and it's hard to freehand a zigzag and not have it get wider as you go, or smaller, or uneven. So this is about making it even when you're not freehanding stuff. To make it alternate properly, when you get to the top, you're going to make your first stop point, and you're going to go down, and the points will be equidistant as you go. And the nice thing about this is you do not have to start and end with complete pieces of geometry at the top or the bottom. If you look at the period ones, if there's a flower that cuts across the middle at the top, it just stops where your pattern just stops wherever it hits it. You don't have to worry about squishing it in or doing complex math for how many of these can I fit, which takes a lot of the pain out of that very quickly. So we are going to look at how to do, in fact, the pattern that I have here on the screen. And for that one, we are going to use this very familiar talon pattern, which, if anybody's seen the sable talon before, with our lovely little bar and ivy friends. If I were doing this with the straight edge, and I could not find my ruler this morning, so I will be freehanding this, but if you have a ruler, I would follow along with one if you're not used to it. As I was pointing out here, we're just going to do it down here on this red one because it's nice and open. If I were to space my spaces out, say, a quarter of an inch, or about as far as it's going to go from this corner to here, I would then do it to about there and there. And I've done this enough that yes, I'm comfortable kind of freehanding this, because if you look at the period ones, they're also not perfectly exact. Most of these people are freehanding things in, whatever weather it is. Even if they're indoors, they don't have air conditioning, they don't have heat in the winter, they don't necessarily have great eyesight. We are not expected to recreate things to the modern idea of perfection. So don't worry about it being exactly. But using a ruler for this will make you feel much more comfortable. I recommend picking an easy to tell delineation on there, something, like quarter inch, if you're doing really small, 1/8 of an inch, just so you can just run it very quickly down and be like, these are my 8ths down one side and up the other.
Lilith, when you bend over like that, we cannot hear you.
Okay, thank you. That's important. All right, what do I need to repeat?
So just as you were leaning down and forward,
Okay.
you were far enough away from the mic, we couldn't hear you. So you might check
all right,
on that.
So, all right. I'm not sure I can turn it up. I think it's at max, but let's see if I can do that. Where would I do that? I can also just talk louder. I was just trying not to blow everybody's ears away. So we'll do this in voice. All right, so what I was trying to say is when you're doing this, In period, if you look, things are not perfectly even either. They're freehanding. Yes, they use tools, so we can use tools. It's not always going to be perfect, and that's okay. It's again a matter of being approximate and even to the visual from, you know, a couple of feet away, really, when it's done. Up close, nothing is ever going to look perfect, and that is okay, because that's not your actual goal for every individual stroke or spot. Once you have your dots down and you've got them spaced, and you'll notice that this is not going to be perfectly even because I'm going to get to the end here, and that's okay. You're going to see how that works. Then you just play connect the dots. Is the nice thing about doing this is you're basically playing connect the dots. I'm going to get my white on my brush, and I'm going to do this without leaning down, so this is going to get fun. But all you're going to do is connect the dots. Stop and start at your dots, spot to spot. And if you decide as you're going down that your dots don't look quite the right distance apart, go ahead and adjust it if you're feeling brave. But when you're done, and when you run out of color, just stop. And that is okay to just stop, because the next pattern is going to pick up. It's going to be something completely different. Because when they do these bar and ivy, you will notice if you look at them that it's never the same pattern through all the colors. The patterns change with every change of color. And usually if one is a zigzag, the next one is going to be curvy, whether it's circles or vines, it's going to be something watery, something smoother. Whereas and then it's going to alternate between that and some sort of boxy or zigzaggy pattern. Keeping that in mind, you know, if we're just starting at this. Now, if you want to look back at, real quick here, my original example of the pattern we're doing, you will notice on the end there that this is a zigzag with a pattern inside it. Now, to make these little guys here, all they are, literally, is tiny V's with feet. They are V's with feet. This is a period pattern. I've seen it on several designs, so somebody liked this one. But they're V's with feet. And at the point where you've got your even zigzag in place, you don't need to worry about being completely exact with your V's and their feet. At this point, you're just going to go in and you're going to draw in your V's. And I like to do the V's before I do the feet to just kind of approximate so they're all about the same distance. You know, you're trying to center it as much as you can off of the zigzag. And it's going to be pretty close. Close is good enough. Because from a distance, this is going to look amazing.
We're seeing your desktop, not your painting, Lilith.
Okay. Get that to come back. All right.
There we go.
Thank you. But yeah, you're just going to zig and zag. And then once you have your little zigzag lines, you get a little more paint and you add feet. And adding feet is as simple as it sounds. They are just little straight lines. So you add a foot, you add a foot, add a foot. Little feet. They're almost dots, but they're a little bit longer than dots. Add little feet. And this geometric plan works for any geometric pattern. If you're doing something long and scrolly with curves, you can mark those out as well. For curves, I tend to mark the points that my curve needs to come to, so that when I'm swirling, the top of the widest part of my swirl before I turn back is what hits my dot or my line. You can do this for circles. For circles, instead of alternating, you would just put your dots directly across from each other, so you would know to keep your circle within the space. But you can use just the basics of laying out your geometric spaces so they're approximately the same size with a ruler in advance for pretty much any pattern. Because trying to keep anything perfectly geometric with freehand is much more difficult than your life needs to be. That's the basics of that pattern. Are there any other questions or anything anybody would like to see? I do have a handout for this class. It is on the Seoran Kingdom Scribble website in the classes. I will double check to make sure when they updated the site, they kept all of those links. It's been there for about 15 years, so it should still be there unless they haven't gotten everything up on the new site. But yes, I do have this. A lot of the images from this are taken from the physical handout that I turned into a PowerPoint last year when I taught this at King's College. Is there anything anyone would like to see? Different geometric patterns? Any other questions? We'll move on. Okay. All righty. Back. So highlighting and shading, which of course is a whole nother category we could spend, in theory, days and several classes on. So we're just going over the very basics of this today. It's all you really need for most of what you're likely to be doing, because the nice thing about most medieval illuminators is they were not Italian Renaissance oil painters. So you're not seeing a lot of very realistic detail and complex shading. In fact, the earlier you go, the simpler the shading gets. A lot of stuff is not horrifically complex, and we're going to go over some simple stuff today. Lining elements like vines and leaves in white or in darker versions of that color are great ways to make light and shadow. You know, you want it to pop. You want it to feel like it's three-dimensional, even though you're painting, you know, on flat surface. And the way they did this in period was very simple lining. So also you can use a lighter version of the base color. The example here from the Ascension is actually a 1450s Italian piece. And then the piece here to your right directly, because it's from the Worms Bible, you can see that these vines are, what's interesting here is if you look at these vines, they highlight and shadow very nicely. They do not follow the modern concept rule that everything has to have a light source from the same location. This is a big thing for light and shadow in the Middle Ages. Some artists, especially the later ones, once you start getting Renaissance oil painters and they start mimicking some of those more natural styles, will be like, my light is coming from this direction, so every shadow is going to be opposite it, and every light source is going to, you know, in that way we're kind of taught in modern painting where, you know, is the light directly above? Is it, you know, where is it coming from? So you know where to put your highlights and your shadows. In a lot of the earlier periods and a variety of styles in period, they care more that it looked geometrically pleasing than that it came from a singular light source. So you'll notice these vines are great because they're light and they're dark, but those light and dark lines follow the same side all the way around. So sometimes dark is on the bottom and sometimes it's on the top. So you do not always have to worry about having everything in exactly the right spot compared to a light source, because in period they did not worry about this very often. Does it look geometric? Does it balance to your eye when you're looking at it from a distance? Will tell you if you've done it okay. And so, for example, on this one, I would say this is a very oversimplified example of what I'm going to show you. You can add there are multiple different layers and ways of doing this. You can just do a highlight line if you're doing something very simple and early with just white. You can do a white line and a color baseline that's a little bit lighter, and you can do, you know, basically a fade without blending. Like you've got your red, a light. This one has a red, a pink, and then a white. You can get really fancy and have a darker shadow on the underside and have 4, which is going to give you very much a rounded multidimensional effect. Depends on how comfortable you are with this and how fancy you want to get. They are all elements of the same basic shading technique. They can be applied straight. They can be applied a couple of different ways. Now, my biggest recommendation here is if you cannot do long straight lines, please do not try and paint long straight lines because you will frustrate yourself if they're wobbly. I cannot do long lines, so I tend to do very short strokes. And when I feel like I'm starting to wobble, I stop. And then when I go back in, I start a little before where I stopped so the brush can get thick again, and I keep going and I do little strokes. We're going to look at some of this here. I'm going to put this up on a different scroll. I'm going to put out real quick. Because there are a few different things here we can do with this. Let's go here. All right, here's everybody's favorite salmon. And I have already solid color based this to start, because the first thing you always do is you paint your base color in and you let it dry. So I did this morning. You'll notice it's currently the light color because often in period when they're shading, you would start with your lighter color, or at least your mid-tone, and then shade lighter and darker. And this one looks very pink. This is actually going to be nice and red when we're done with it. And similar to what I showed in the example, we can shade this thing to give it more of an effect. So what I would do for this one, or what I'm going to do for this one today, just because I can, is I'm going to get my medium color out here. And I'm going to shade, going to decide that that's the top and this is the bottom, and I'm just going to fill this in. And you notice I'm going to leave part of it. I'm going to leave the part I want to leave lighter colored for highlighting purposes, and I'm just going to fill this in. And if you're really uncomfortable with this, you could put a light line or like a dot of guiding lines down the center of this with a ruler to know how far you want to go in advance, kind of like we did with the geometry, because the paint will cover little tiny dots of pencil if you don't draw too dark. But I'm just going to freehand this one because it does not have to be exact, but you can shade this in as you're going. And kind of like what happened in that other one, you'll notice when we get down here to the bottom, this leg curls. So as an artist, I would have to decide, am I going to try and keep with the lighting on this and change where I'm putting my darker colors for shadow purposes when I get down here? Or am I just going to follow it around for the nice continuation of line and keep going with my darker color? Now, in this particular instance, because it's Celtic and the Celts were not big on having to have a particular point of light from any particular direction, I'm going to keep going like we did in the Verms that we saw a minute ago and just keep this in a nice consistent line. And you'll notice this is not perfect. There's a little bit of line here. I can go back in if I want to, and I can go back in with the lighter color when this is dry and thicken that up again if I want to, or I can just leave it. Because we are doing this quickly. Normally I would do this obviously a little bit more slowly if we were not doing this as a class, but sometimes you have to scribe in a hurry. You know, the crown walks up to you an hour before court and says, we are short a scroll, can you paint something? I have had that happen, and I did. I set a new record for myself on painting a charter that day. But it's okay. And remember, when they were doing this for a living, they were trying to meet quotas too. So.
I have a question.
Yes.
When you're breathing, how does your breathing affect, especially when you're doing fine lines?
Okay, so that's a wonderful question. And this was actually one of the first things I got taught by a peer in on or ever, because he took one look at my first piece in a competition and told me I was breathing wrong. When you're breathing in or out, there's that moment of pause between the two. And when you change whether you're breathing in or out, you move a little bit. You want your brush to be smooth. You want your line to be smooth. You want to move your brush, especially on fine line work or drawing, as you breathe out, nice and smoothly. That will actually help you not have little wobbles and bubbles. It's just as you're breathing out, it becomes very meditative, really, then, as you're scribing and you're like, and breathe, and just painting along. And that will actually help make it smoother, makes it even. Why that is important. But I said, he took one look at, I had been drawing acanthus leaves, which are all sorts of flippy. And he was like, these are great, but I can tell you're breathing wrong because of the lines. I was like, I have learned a thing. And he was very nice about it. I was asked if I was okay with constructive criticism before he brought it up. And I was like, yes, please. I will learn this thing. But yes, breathing does in fact impact how smooth your line is. Which also implies then that the more stressed you get about it, or the more hyped up you get about it, the more likely you are to have mistakes. So staying calm and relaxed and kind of going with the flow a little bit, because you know it's going to be a little uneven. It's not going to be perfect. It's a great way to let go of being like a complete perfectionist, really, is to realize that in period, that was not the goal. And now that I have my darker color, I can decide if I want to go even darker. And if I do, I have this lovely pre-mixed dark version of this color. And since my brush is already very red, I'm going to go ahead and do a little shading with my pre-mixed dark shade. And for this, you would choose a point that's a little bit further in. You know, it could be a quarter, it could be just a little bit, but then you're going to line it. And this one is very dark comparatively. So this is going to show up really dark right now, but it's good for seeing in the class. That I'm giving it this nice shade. And you'll notice I do very small strokes because otherwise I end up very uneven. I have seen people who can do long, perfectly even strokes, and they're amazing. There are very few of those. Oh, and there I put too much water down. It happens to everybody. So when that happens, I have a couple of options. Clean out my brush. I come in here, dry brush. I'm going to pick that right back up with my dry brush. Take off the extra water. And I can let that dry and I can touch it up with my paint again. But out of curiosity, do I have anybody painting along today? Or are we all just watching? That's okay. When we get to do this in person, I always bring supplies so people can actually try this out in person as we're going. Because it's really fun to have that option.
I guess you could say I'm thread painting today.
That counts. You can totally paint with thread. If you're shading.
Not exactly painting, but I'm doing some drawing for my class, which is right after yours.
After my 2 classes? Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. Is it the tempera class again?
It is indeed.
Awesome. That's a great class. Everyone should stay after and go to his class too.
I don't know, lower your expectations. I'm still sick with COVID, so I don't know. I might just be ranting gibberish the whole time.
It could be fun though.
That's true.
Gibberish. Tribal gibberish. But there's that. And then of course, to come back in here and highlight at the end. Now, of course, the fun with this is if I wanted to on this, I could either come in and highlight with white, or because it's Celtic, if I wanted to, once my shading is dried, I could then go over this with a pattern like the white dots or little circles or swirls or something and pattern over the shading. and give it even more of an interesting kind of a pop effect. Because the Celts did all sorts of crazy things that defy any law of natural order or realism whatsoever. They were not worried about it looking real. But that's some basic shading. And we're going to look at a couple of other things here in a minute on shading, because we still have a few minutes. We've actually got plenty of time. And that is these little examples is how do you do that when you have multiple directions and shapes? And so here's a basic example of just the white line version on leaves. You can do a full complex 3 or 4 color shade on leaves if you want to. And the later the period you get, the more you're going to see more complex shading. But even if you're just starting out and you just need it to pop a little bit, a white line, you'll see on this example, I had picked the highlight point as kind of coming from the top, but not perfectly. But it's just as long as it's balanced. So if it's one way on one half of the scroll, do it the same way on the other side. However it's symmetrical, keep it symmetrical. Whether you have a singular light source or not. It is possible to just balance that out. It's just a matter of, it doesn't look good visually, you're fine when it's done. And then on the leaves here, on the talon, which I was just working on a talon, I could demonstrate some of this as well. You'll see how they use, this one uses darker underside on the leaves and a lighter overside, and then the shading is applied to the darker and the white highlight to the lighter to give it more depth. And in this case, it's all blue, which gives it kind of a realistic effect of, it could be a plant if it's a blue plant. But you can feel the curve of the leaves. You can feel that there's depth. It goes back in some places and forward in others visually. And that's not a complicated shade. Certainly not as complicated as the whitework barb pattern on that example behind it. But these are the basics you can use in throughout it. Here are my sources. If you're ever looking for source material, the books on here, a lot of these are direct links, and I can share these with anybody who really wants them a little bit later. Because a lot of this, and I have a whole class actually on finding scribal resources. That's a different class, but there's a lot of stuff that's online now. So looking at examples of these, like, okay, how did they shade this? How did they use dots on this scroll? How did they pick the geometric pattern? Which one did they use? The nice thing about all of these is if you look at period examples, if you see it on a scroll, it's period. Your evidence is right there on the page, which is wonderful. And you can look through other scrolls and be like, oh, I want to try that geometric pattern. It's simple and it's cute, and I can draw that out with my dots. Like a Greek key or circles, squares, more zigzag patterns and things to put in them. The way they use dots, as I pointed out, there's outlining, there's fill with trios, little clusters, there's different things they do with dots. And the shading, which if you get really late period, yes, you can get into some very, what we would consider almost modern levels of blending and shading. But they didn't do that as much in the illumination until you get very late period in Europe. So most of what you're going to be doing, as long as it's balanced, you're good. And if you happen to be coloring it through and realize, oops, I didn't shade this leaf the right way, probably no one's going to notice. So it's fine. You can go back and fix it if you want. In fact, a very important thing to remember is if you put down the white and you hate it, let it dry and you can paint that base dark color right back over it, let it dry and try it again. And now that only works a couple of times, but I had one scroll where I was trying to do gold work detailing on red, and I had to retry it like 7 times because it was not cooperating. 7. And I went back over that thing in solid red repeatedly until it got it where I wanted it. So if you really hate it, you can paint over it. That's the joy of gouache, and its lovely opaque qualities. Is not only can you layer, you can use it to fix things you didn't like. So don't be afraid to try it and have it not work, because you can fix it. All right. Are there any other questions? Anything anyone would like to see or re-see demonstrated? Okay, well, that's what I had today, and thank you all so much for coming. We are good. My next class is starting at 2. They kind of swapped my order, so the next class is actually my super beginner class for basically informative for people who are interested in getting started in Scribble in the SCA. So if you're here, you probably already know the information that's in that class. So you're welcome to stay. If not, please go and enjoy your day. The handout, to answer that question again, is actually on the Kingdom Scribble website in the resources. It's been there for about 15 years. So I might want to update the images on it at some point, but it's been there for 15 years. And this class has not changed much because the methods are working. So, but it is available to anyone at any time. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellis.
You're welcome.